This talk concerns life and death in ancient Cambridgeshire. It's entitled Peopling the A14, and it concerns the evidence for funerary archaeology and burial on a very large project in Cambridgeshire. Before I go any further, I should caution that there will be images or photographs of skeletal remains in this talk. So if you feel uncomfortable viewing such photographs, please do not continue to view this presentation. Okay, well, on the A14, we had evidence of funerary activity covering about 3,500 years, stretching from the Bronze Age to the Anglo-Saxon period and beyond. And because these are fairly broad periods of time, we did something that we do on most sites, and that is to divide these large periods into sub-periods. So, for example, for period 4, the Bronze Age, we have the late Neolithic to early Bronze Age, period 4.1. Then we move on to period 4.2, the early Bronze Age, and then period 4.3, the early to middle Bronze Age, etc., etc. It basically just helps us refine the dating evidence that we get from radiocarbon analysis, and basically to fit everything into a neater picture, really, as far as the archaeology is concerned. So these are our burials. I've divided them into inhumations and cremations, or burnt bone deposits. The cremations are in grey and the inhumations are in brown. And I've shown them in this graph by period and also by landscape block. And as you can probably see, it's not an even distribution. There's quite a lot of difference between the different landscape blocks and periods, and this is partly because of differing funerary activity and burial practices over the different periods, and also because the landscape blocks are not all the same. For example, Alconbury was relatively small and contains very few burials, whereas Brampton West and Fenstanton Gravels were quite big areas. It is also maybe the case that it just happened that some cemeteries occurred in areas that we excavated and outside other areas that we excavated. So to some degree, there's an element of chance. Perhaps the overwhelming impression from this graph really is the small number of burials over this 3,500 year period. We only had 186 cremations and 94 inhumations. And we certainly know that from the settlement evidence that there must have been many, many more living throughout these periods of time. Now, it's always been a rural area, of course, so not as densely packed as urban areas, but we should have a lot more individuals. And this is partly, we think, down to burial practice, and also perhaps down to agricultural practices. It may be that some of the shallow inhumations and cremations were ploughed away at one time or another. So in this graph, what I've done is I combined all the evidence from all the landscape blocks to show the burials by period. And to a certain extent, this perhaps shows the type of activity we see in many areas of the British Isles, where we get in the Bronze Age a large number of cremation cemeteries, and this in the A14 is particularly in the Middle Bronze Age, with very few inhumations, just isolated interments. And then moving on to the Iron Age, most burials seem to disappear, which is very odd. Very few cremations, and again, the odd isolated inhumation. And it's clear from this that burial, as we know it, was a minority right during the Iron Age, reserved for only certain individuals. Most people seem to have been treated in some different way whereby their remains or evidence of their disposal does not survive in the archaeological record. Now, this could be because they were in some way curated or stored either above ground or in perhaps pits that were accessible. And we know that human remains were continue to be, I suppose, in use or in circulation for some time after the death of these people. So it seems that there was some sort of afterlife for these remains. And there's also theories concerning exhumation and excarnation, where perhaps bodies were left out in the open and perhaps scavengers came and took some of the remains. Whatever the case, we have very, very little evidence of human remains for the Iron Age. So something was going on that we don't fully understand as yet. Then moving on to the Roman period, we have a change really, where we start to see a lot more inhumations and perhaps what you might call the start of cemeteries as we know them. Then moving on to the Anglo-Saxon period, we have less evidence of settlement and of burial. Let's want to take a closer look at the evidence for Roman inhumations in particular, in part because really it's the only group of inhumations for which we have quite a large sample size. We have 61 in total, 45 adults and 16 subadults. And it's interesting to look at these in terms of period. Certainly, as I said before, in the Iron Age, we get very, very few inhumations. And the Iron Age inhumations tend to be isolated burials, individuals laid on their side in sort of a crouched or flexed position, sometimes with evidence that some of the limbs may have been tied or in some way restricted before burial. And we tend to see this continuing on the A14 into the Roman period itself. So there seems to be some sort of continuity going on, perhaps pockets of conservatism in certain rural areas where the Iron Age traditions continued, at least in funerary terms. And what we find actually, as far as the Roman period is concerned, we get similar types of burials going on into the mid-Roman period. So very few burials, isolated, lying on their side. I think 10 out of the 11 inhumations we found were buried on their sides in a crouched position. And this only seems to change in the late Roman period, when we get this sudden dramatic increase in the number of inhumations. And instead of being isolated burials, they are grouped into small cemeteries. Another interesting factor is that we get a change in burial position. Instead of being crouched, the burials now tend to be extended and supine, face up. And we tend to get a lot of iron nails in the fills of the graves, suggesting that these individuals may have been contained in some form of wooden container or coffin. So there seems to be quite a dramatic change in the late Roman period in burial practice. And there's something also interesting if we look at the perinatal burials in the Roman period. Perinatal being individuals who died at or around the time of death. Now, in the Iron Age, about 50% of all burials were of perinatal age. And again, we see this trend continuing into the Roman period up to the mid-Roman period. And then a dramatic drop-off in the proportion of perinatal burials, not because there was better treatment perhaps or more survival of the young in the late Roman period, but probably because we get more survival and more evidence of adult burials in the late Roman period. So as a proportion of total burials, the perinatal burials fall quite dramatically. And this seems to, again, mirror that change between the mid-Roman and late Roman period, when it's dramatic change in the number of burials. Another interesting factor about these very young burials is that they tend to be found in ditches. We don't always know exactly how they were deposited, how much care was taken in their burial. But what seems clear is that there seems to be some difference in the Iron Age and in the Roman period in the burial of the very, very young when compared to older children and adults, in that we do not get the older individuals surviving in the funerary record, but we do get these perinates. So it may be that they were so young that they were treated in a different way, or they didn't qualify for certain funerary rites that were applied to older individuals. What we had, in fact, was such a large number of perinates relative to adults that had a look at how much of the field work had involved excavating ditch sections. With such a large area, you can't excavate every ditch, but I think overall about 10% of the fill of all the ditches in the Roman period were excavated. So in effect, we only perhaps have about 10% of the number of perinate individuals that we would have if we excavated the whole length of these ditches. So in fact, these high proportions of perinates relative to other burials may in fact be a gross underestimate. Many of these perinate burials were not discovered on site, but in post-excavation work. As the ditch sections were excavated, they were excavated together with animal bone and other remains. And in fact, we only saw them when the animal bone specialists found them within their animal bone remains and passed them on to us. But we could tell from the completeness of the remains that these individuals were probably buried complete. They went into the ground probably in a complete state. So again, this shows that what we have is probably an underestimate of the number of perinate burials. If you think about it, if you're out in a very muddy field, digging up ditch sections, and you've got these tiny perinate bones that you can hardly see anyway, and they're all covered in mud, you're just not going to see them all. So that's why it's important to do these ditch sections and to process them properly and have a good look at what comes out of them. Okay, just to have a little break, I thought I would show you a little video of one of my colleagues, Mike Henderson, laying out a skeleton. This is what we have to do before we look at any skeleton. It's the basis of analysis. We lay the skeleton out in anatomical position, and that allows us to study the age, the sex, and any signs of pathological changes in the individual. So I'll just show you this quickly. Okay, thank you for that, Mike. As you can see, he's a fairly quick worker. Right, I think we're good to move on to have a look at a few interesting examples of burials. And first, we're going to start off in Bar Hill, the landscape block at Bar Hill, and the targeted excavation area number 38. Bar Hill was down towards the southeast of the road scheme. And here we see in the main picture two circular enclosures, and then just to the southeast of them we have a silted up waterhole or well, where we found a number of burials. And interestingly, these were young burials. We had inhumation 38.74. That was a double burial of children, very rare from the Iron Age. And then we had a couple of early Roman burials as well in this same feature. Now, it could be that they were deliberately selected to be buried in the silt of the waterhole or well. It seems to be the case. We do have to be slightly careful, though, in case they slumped down into the silt, having been buried there, and this in some way protected them from later disturbance, for example, ploughing in the surrounding area. But as far as we can see, there were no other burials surrounding this waterhole. And in fact, it's quite well attested in the Iron Age, a connection between watercourses and ritual activity. You tend to get place deposits and human remains in watercourses. It's been theorized that perhaps there's a thought that these were liminal spaces between the world of the living and the dead. Whatever the case, it seems that the waterhole performed some kind of both functional and symbolic function, really. And we're going to take a closer look at the double burial in particular. And here it is. It's a bit difficult to see, but it is lying on a bed of stones. And on the right-hand side, you can see a close-up of the burial. Towards the top left is the skull of a child who died between about 2.5 and 3 years of age. You can see that the head and the backbone and the pelvis and the legs. And then just to the right, lying on the left shoulder of the first individual, is a younger child, aged about 7 to 11 months at death. It's clear that as they're lying on the shoulder of the other individual, they were placed second into the grave. However, this is certainly a double burial. Both individuals may have died at the same time. And luckily for us, we were able to get DNA evidence from both these individuals from the Crick Institute in London. And this told us that both individuals were male, they had male genetic sex, and also they were related. They were second-degree relatives, most likely half-brothers. And even more interesting, perhaps, is that they both had the same mother, but different fathers. There's something else they had in common. When we looked at the bone changes in these individuals, we found something interesting going on in the skulls, particularly in the sphenoid bones, which are located at the side of the skull and then run underneath the base of the skull. And in particular, we looked at what we call the lesser wings of the sphenoids. The bone on the left is from the 2 to 3 year old, and you can probably see that the top of the bone is sort of ivory-like, but then further down it becomes more porous. And this is a sign of new bone growth. It's reacting to inflammation or bleeding in the soft tissues adjacent to the bone. And if we look at the picture on the right, we see another lesser wing of the sphenoid, this time from the 7 to 11 year old. And you can see it's very, very porotic. And this again is a sign of inflammation or bleeding in the soft tissues adjacent to the bone. And we also found changes in the orbits of the skull and on the top of the cranium that were similar in fashion to these changes. And this is often interpreted as a sign of vitamin C deficiency. Now, the bone changes occur because if you don't get enough vitamin C, then it affects the protein, the collagen that helps build your connective tissues. This includes your veins, for example, and if there's damage to your blood vessels, then they can start to hemorrhage or bleed. And this may lead to the changes that we're seeing in the skulls of these individuals. Once the connective tissue is weakened, then it only takes minor trauma or just normal activities such as chewing to cause damage to these connective tissues, and in theory, they may start to hemorrhage. And scurvy is a relatively common condition in populations that have food shortages. If you get scurvy, you're going to feel lethargic and tired. You're going to have musculoskeletal pain. It won't necessarily kill you itself, but it will affect your immune system and leave you more vulnerable to infectious disease. And infectious disease was a real killer in the past, and it may well be that both these half-brothers succumbed to infectious disease due to reduced immune systems. Now, many animals can make their own vitamin C, but of course, humans have to eat vegetables, citrus fruits, and oily fish, that kind of thing. And that helps us build up our vitamin C reserves. Without those, during times of famine, for example, then we do become vulnerable to scurvy. Interestingly, the younger individual, the 7 to 11-year-old, also had bowing or bent tibial bones, the shin bones, and it seems likely that they also suffered from rickets or vitamin D deficiency. Now, you suffer from that if you don't get enough sunlight, so it may be that the child was sickly and kept indoors and therefore not exposed to sufficient sunlight to avoid vitamin D deficiency. Now, as well as DNA evidence, we also had isotope analysis done on both these individuals. And what this shows us is that it seems that they were both brought up or raised in the local Cambridgeshire area, and that they were both probably breastfed. We know that because looking at the red lines on the graph, they go up to quite a high level compared to the mother's level of nitrogen. And the mother's level of nitrogen is shown by the red dotted line on the graph. And this is taken as a sign of breastfeeding. Now, on the left-hand side in the graph, you can see that the red line on the graph comes down quite dramatically around the age of 1.5 years. And we've taken this as a sign, perhaps, of weaning, a time when an individual is at risk due to a change of diet and a higher risk of mortality. If we look on the right-hand side, the younger individual, aged 7 to 11 months at death, we see that the nitrogen level in red is still fairly high, and this suggests that they died before weaning took place. Okay, just moving on to another Iron Age artifact, and this is what's called a bone comb. We don't know exactly what it was used for, but we found a broken half of what looks like a comb. And the interesting thing about this in particular was that it was fashioned from a human skull. It was cut freshly from a skull. It wasn't an old skull. It was someone who died fairly recently. And of course, the individual may still have had some flesh or have been had their full head of hair when this was done. So it seems to have been a very deliberate act. This wasn't an act mistaken for an animal bone or something. This was it was known that this was a human when it was done. And it may be some sort of pendant. It had a hole in the center, so it may have been hung from somewhere on a belt or around the neck or something like that. We don't know exactly what its function was, whether it was used as a comb for an animal or human, a horse perhaps, we don't know. But it could also be some sort of memoriam or object that remembers a relative, perhaps the remains of a relative, or even perhaps of an enemy. But it's a particularly interesting example of work bone, and there have been similar ones found in the area of Bar Hill. Okay, moving on to the Roman period. We're again looking at Bar Hill, the same area, TEA 38, and we can see that there's mostly early Roman activity in this area, followed by a little bit of Middle Roman activity, and then a late Roman cemetery right down the bottom, containing what we would call the first perhaps evidence we have of what you might call a cemetery in terms of what we would call a cemetery these days. And what we have is 9 individuals, 7 adults, including 4 males and 2 females. We also have 2 children, one very young, perinate, and 1 child aged about 5 years of age. And what we're going to do is look at one individual in particular. So I've circled on the plan. And here they are. So a male individual who died between the ages of 26 and 35. And you can see that they're laid out in late Roman style, laid out supine and extended face up. And I've just included the drawing by the archaeologist there because it shows the kind of detail that you need to put into your sketch when you're recording a skeleton prior to lifting it. And all this is very important information, not just for the field team, but for the specialists as well. A context number has been given to the grave cut, to the grave fill, to the skeleton itself, and also to the various finds in the grave, most of which are iron nails, probably from some kind of container or coffin. And this individual, when we looked at the skeleton, we found some interesting bone changes in the spine, particularly severe examples of joint disease for the age of the individual. We had osteoarthritis in the synovial joints of the spine. We also had what we call intervertebral disc disease, where we get severe pitting on the vertebral bodies. And we had osteophytes, where the bodies tend to spread out in order to distribute the weight of the body as a whole, because there's damage to the intervertebral discs. So this individual for their age had very, very severe changes, kind of changes you'd normally expect to see in someone who was very elderly. And it suggests that they were involved in quite intensive labor, possibly something to do with agriculture, of course. Also, this individual, we had an interesting example of pathological change in one of the elbows, the right elbow. I put on the left-hand side, both elbows together. You can see that on the right side, the base of the humerus, the bottom end of the humerus, that's the bone that's at the top, is quite expanded, and it's a different form to one on the left. And this is because it's been fractured right in the middle of the articular surface. And this is when the forearm, the top of the forearm, has been jammed up into the humerus, into the elbow. And it's caused very, very severe changes and remodeling to the articular facets. It's also caused secondary joint disease or osteoarthritis. And it may be the reason why this individual was buried with their arm at 90 degrees, as you can see on the right-hand side. It may be that the arm was fixed in this location due to these severe changes. Probably it's quite a rare form of trauma these days. It tends to be caused by a severe blow to the elbow. Whether they fell from height or whether they were hit by something, we can't really tell, but quite a severe injury. But it gives you an idea of the life of some of these people. We certainly found quite severe joint disease in over 50% of adults buried in this cemetery. Okay, I just want to talk briefly about one of the Roman cremations, the late Roman cremations, and this was found actually just to the south of this cemetery that I was talking about previously. We thought that it may be a precursor of the inhumation cemetery, but actually appears to have been buried around the same time. And here it is. This is quite a nice example and quite a lucky survival, because it's pretty much intact. We're just missing some of the rim, which has been disturbed probably by ploughing and the excavation. But as you can see, the urn containing the cremation is pretty intact. And this means that there's been less mixture of soil with the bone inside. It also means that the bone is better preserved. And we can say more about the individual or the individuals who were inside. Now, what we can do when we look at this bone is have a look at the state of preservation. If there's weathering, then it may be that the bone and the remains were left on the pyre for some time after the burning took place, and left out in the rain and the weather for a period of time. In this case, there were no signs of weathering, so it seems that they were collected fairly quickly from the pyre and put into the urn. Also, we can tell that it was probably just a single adult individual who was put into the urn. There are no repeating elements, and we find elements from all areas of the skeleton. And this implies that the collection of the remains following the cremation was fairly carefully done. So it wasn't just a token deposit in the urn. They actually took care to collect quite a lot of the bone. And we do have 600 grams approximately of bone within the urn. And this is a reasonable amount for an archaeological cremation, although in modern cremations you can get much more than this. This is just another view of the urn. Again, I thought I'd put in a diagram just to show how the archaeologist works, recording all the sections and showing the context numbers associated with the layer, the cut, and the fill, and the urn itself, and the fill within the urn. It's all recorded, all given its own numbers. Okay, one unexpected thing about this particular cremation was that it wasn't all burnt bone. We had a couple of bones that were clearly unburnt. In fact, they were in very, very good condition. And these are a couple of ribs. And if you look at them, they look fairly similar. And they look to be from someone who was perhaps a late teenage or early adult age when they died. And I believe that they come from the same individual. And when I first recorded these, I recorded these as fractures because I didn't believe what I was looking at. But I had to go back and record them again because they are clearly sawn bones. And you can tell that both from looking very closely at the sawn edges. You see what we call false starts, where they begin sawing and then it doesn't quite go right and they have to pull the saw out again and start again. And we also see what we call snap-offs. So if you can imagine sawing through a piece of wood, you often don't get a clean cut, but right at the end, the wood snaps off and leaves an overhanging edge. And this, again, shows us that a saw was used in this case. And it also gives us valuable information about the direction of the sawn cut. And the interesting thing about this is that it was sawn from the inside out. Now, we've seen plenty of examples of sawn ribs in our work on post-medieval burials, where we look at individuals who have undergone autopsy and they saw through the rib cage to expose the vital organs to inspect them. But of course, they are sawn from the outside, so this is very unusual. And I think that probably these ribs were articulated when they were sawn. They were articulated together, and this means that they were still fleshed. So it may well be that someone had a portion of a torso of an individual and divided it up, sawed it up, whatever they did with it, for whatever reason, and these two ribs, these rib sections were left, and they were stored. We know that the person who underwent this sawing died before the person in the cremation urn. So there was a long enough period before that we can tell that they died before the other person. And these remains must have been stored somewhere. They're in such good condition, they must have been stored fairly carefully. And then for whatever reason, they were placed with the burnt bone into the cremation urn. So very unusual behavior. Okay, moving on. Finally, to the Saxon period, we're moving on to the Conington landscape block. This is more in the middle of the A14 road scheme. And we're looking at here in blue, a large circular enclosure. And the area of the enclosure where there was a very large gate that had been removed, perhaps shortly before the settlement was abandoned. Now, after they removed one of these posts, they placed a burial into the hole that was left and then covered it up. And this is, we think, probably about 8th century burial in very, very good condition. And the unusual thing about this is that the burial is face down. Now, you do find face down or prone burials in the Saxon period throughout Britain, but they are rare. And it seems to be some unusual form of burial practice. Some people call it deviant or anomalous. So there's all kinds of descriptions for this form of burial. And it may be that there's something different about this particular individual. People have done studies on prone burials, and they've tried to identify the reason behind it. But it doesn't seem to be any particular connection with, say, the sex, the biological sex of an individual, or the age. It's not particularly restricted to younger people or older people in particular. So it's a bit of a mystery. But people have theorized that it may be something to do with some kind of otherness, someone who perhaps acted or looked different to other people in who they lived with or lived among. It may be someone who perhaps suffered an unexpected death, perhaps a suicide or a murder, or someone who died before their time or the cause of death was unclear. There have been theories about perhaps someone who was executed or some kind of sacrifice, or a criminal perhaps. What we can tell about this particular individual is that they were someone who died around the age of 15 years. And from the DNA evidence, we know that genetically they were a female. Looking at the skeleton itself, we have quite a bit of evidence of joint disease. We also have signs that they suffered periods of malnutrition in earlier childhood. And we could also look at the position of the body itself. As you can see, that the skeleton is very well preserved, which of course helps osteologists. Another important thing is that the skeleton is complete, which is fantastic for us, because often with diseases, you need the whole skeleton to be able to ascertain what they may have been suffering from. As it is, we couldn't find anything that might have caused the death of the individual. But of course, we only see the skeleton, we don't see the soft tissue, so we don't get the full picture. One point of interest is that there was an interesting position of the feet and the legs. The left leg had been quite severely rotated, and the heel of the right foot was placed right on top and very close to the heel of the left foot, quite an unnatural position. And it may be that the feet of this, or the ankles of this individual, were tied before they were buried. Okay, I think I will end there. Thank you very much for your attention, and just some acknowledgements here to finish with. Thank you.